Okay, everyone, I want to welcome to evening sessions at the Bay County Library System. This evening's program is with Kathryn Remlinger. She is a professor and she's going to be talking about her book, Yooper Talk. We have the evening sessions twice a month, the first and third Wednesday of every month. Evening sessions is a monthly adult program series featuring a fun and engaging mix of presentations, lectures, workshops, demonstrations, author visits, and performances on topics covering the arts, culture, history, science, and more. You can learn about the evening sessions from our newsletter. You can request it when you come to pick up something, or you can sign up for it on our homepage. And I think that's it. I do want to remind you that the next program will be in 2 weeks. It's going to be author Robert Knapp about his book, Gangsters Up North here in Michigan. And we're looking forward to that. So right now I'm going to introduce you to Kathryn Remlinger, and I hope you all enjoy the program. We will be taking questions at the end of the program. So anything you want to ask, just type in and we'll ask them at the end. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Rochelle. I want to start by thanking the people and organizations who've made my research in this talk possible. Of course, the library, Alice and Jack Wirt Library in Bay City, and to Rochelle Collins for inviting me to give this talk. I'm also grateful to the many others who supported my work over the past 20 years that I've been working on this project. Grand Valley State University, where I teach linguistics in the Applied Linguistics program, my students and colleagues. The University of Wisconsin Press, who published my book, Yooper Talk, Dialect as Identity in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and the many participants that have made my research possible, and some of whom you'll read some of their things, or I'll talk about some of their ideas tonight, and friends and family who've supported my work along the way, as well as you. Thanks for joining tonight. I'll have time at the end for questions and comments, and I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say. Excuse me, I'm going to start sharing my screen here with you. And let's see here, excuse me. My presentation tonight will focus on the social and linguistic histories of English in the Upper Peninsula, or Yooper Talk. And I'll explain how the dialect has emerged over time. To describe the dialect, I'll focus on three main elements that make a dialect a dialect. There are other things too, but these are the three main ones. The sounds, or the phonology of the dialect, the words or vocabulary, and then grammatical structures. I'll look forward to your questions and comments, like I said, and get started here. Oops. Sorry, I'm working with two different devices here. I focus my research in the northwestern part of the UP, from Marquette up and through the Keweenaw Peninsula, which you see here circled on the map. I chose this area of the UP not only because this is the area that I have the most contacts. I was a graduate student at Michigan Tech for 5 years and have many friends in the area. And they've helped me connect with people locally to do interviews and collect other kinds of data. But more important, this is the area where that ubiquitous stereotypical Yooper voice comes from. And I'm really curious how this voice gets connected with the idea of what it means to be a Yooper. I'm particularly interested in this idea of the dialect and how the connection between the dialect and this identity of the Yooper has emerged over time through historical and social events like immigration and language contact between English and the different languages that have come into contact with English with immigrants, as well as language spoken by the indigenous Ojibwe, Anishinaabemoan, or I'll also call it Ojibwe. Economic factors like mining and agriculture, timber, tourism, and language attitudes that we have and that we reinforce through media such as movies, TV, social media posts and memes in our everyday conversations with family, friends, and at work. This evening, I'll explain that the dialect, its words, its sounds, grammatical structures, are a result of social factors and historical events that continue to draw people to the region. excuse me. To understand what makes a dialect, it's important to know its history. The history of English in the Northwestern Upper Peninsula is relatively recent compared to other dialects in the United States. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that English speakers regularly visited and then inhabited the northwestern part of UP. The eastern part of UP was settled by English speakers earlier. The dialect's recent history, combined with the area's isolation, the people who've immigrated to the area where they've settled, the languages that they speak, are all factors that maintain the dialect and its distinct features. 5 major factors have helped the dialect to develop into the variety it is. Geography, particularly isolation, historical events in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, such as the French-Prussian War and World War I, that pushed people toward other places from Europe and Scandinavia and pushed them to places like the UP. Language contact between speakers of English and other languages, including Italian, Polish, German, Canadian French, Finnish, Ojibwe, and many other languages. Economics, including land, mining, agriculture, shipping, and tourism. And then there's language attitudes, what we think about as good and bad English. Now, this is a little fun part, I think. To begin, here's an important definition. I'm assuming you all know that what a Yooper is. Here's a definition from the MerriamWebster Collegiate Dictionary, which added the word in 2014. As you no doubt know, the name derives from the pronunciation of the acronym UP with right? So a person from the UP, Yooper. Because Yooper is a well-known word in Michigan, you might be surprised that it wasn't until 2014 that it appeared in this popular dictionary. It all began with a Scrabble game, and yet it took 12 years and a persistent Scrabble player to get Yooper dictionary worthy. Steve Parks solicited Merriam-Webster to include Yooper beginning in 2002. His 12-year letter writing campaign started with a Scrabble game in which he wanted to use the word Yooper, but his opponent said, no, it's not in any dictionary. So Parks wisely chose Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, it's the most popular dictionary, and asked them to put it in. Well, the editor said, it's not widely enough known. A word has to be widely enough known to be in this dictionary, and other dictionaries are different. But finally, after sending them a lot of evidence, many, many letters, and there was a change of editors at the dictionary. It's probably helped too. The word got in, and you can find it right between your and yoo-hoo, and it's in the online dictionary as well. But the emergence of Yooper didn't happen as a word really until around 1975 in print. And it wasn't during the mid-70s that Yooper was popularly used in the UP. And you can see that in this timeline. But it's important to realize that although Yooper dates in print from 1975, it existed well before this in spoken language. Words have to exist in spoken language before they ever appear in popular print. In these examples, we see attitudes at work and their effects on what it means to be a Yooper, some of which are tied to what it means to sound like a Yooper. For example, in 1975, we have the emergence of Yooper in the newspaper, The Pick and Axe. 1982, Michael Luukkonen, who's a sociologist and filmmaker at Northern Michigan University, he created a film, and you can see connections there with perceptions about what it means to be a Yooper. 1983, Jack Bauer's famous bumper sticker, maybe you have one on your car, say yeah to the UPA. And in 1986, do Yoopers make connections among dialect people in place? This connection is most evident in the name Yooper, which is used today for both the residents and the dialect, and of course, which derives from the place name. It's important to recognize that Yooper has contested meanings. It can be used derogatorily as well as a point of pride, and we can see some of that reflected here. Over the last 30 years, however, connotations of Yooper have become better, or what we call ameliorated. They've become more positive than negative, in part as a result of the tourist industry and excuse me, and shifting economies. For at least 5,000 years, Ojibwe mined copper in the UP and iron as well. And yet it wasn't until the 1600s that French missionaries, French Canadian voyageurs, and European explorers regularly visited the area. Over the next century, expeditions were made to investigate the rich iron and copper deposits, which led to determined effort to mine the region. And I should say, instead of just mining copper and iron, Ojibwe have lived for over 5,000 years in the UP, but lived there seasonally. Over the next century, expeditions were made. Oh, sorry. I'm obviously reading so that I stay on track, and sorry about that. But the discovery of the world's largest deposit of native copper in 1842 drew thousands specifically to the Keweenaw Peninsula. And from 1840 through the early 1900s, it was a booming timber and copper mining region, boasting a population of 80,000 in 1900. We can compare that to today's population of the Keweenaw Peninsula, which is comprised of Baraga, Houghton, and Keweenaw counties. And today's population is about 46,000, so nearly half is less. As a result of the copper boom, the region became known as the Copper Country, and most adults were in some way connected with the mines and the mining industry. The majority of those came to work in the mines and related industries, such as logging, which not only was necessary to clear the land to get at the rock beneath, but also to use as framing structures in the mines, railroad ties above and below ground, and specific to the iron industry to make charcoal for firing the kilns. In fact, today, the timber and charcoal industries remain vital to the UP's economy. Because of these industries and the promise of prosperity, Marquette and the Copper Country drew people from far and wide: Finland, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, Cornwall, England, Italy, particularly the Piedmont region, France, Germany, Canada, and the Austrian Empire, which today includes Croatia, Slovenia, and other countries. There were even people who settled there from China. In addition, people resettled from the Midwest and the East Coast, particularly Boston. And you can see that in some of the place names, like Quincy Mine is named after an area outside of Boston. In addition to being pulled to the region, historical events such as war and famine pushed people to the UP from Scandinavia, Finland, Great Britain, Central and Eastern Europe, and beyond. Excuse me. While some people settled in rural areas, others were attracted to larger towns like Marquette, Houghton, Hancock, Calumet, and Ontonagon, with the promise of prosperity earned from businesses and shops. Collectively, industry, agriculture, education, and commerce were needed to sustain this burgeoning community. The growing population and seemingly endless supply of copper and iron continued to draw laborers, merchants, artisans, teachers, and others to the region through the early 1900s, when production slowed and the immigration restrictions curtailed or limited people of certain nationalities from entry into the US. For example, in 1924, there was an immigration restriction that limited the, people by percentages, ratios of who could come in. And one group that was targeted were Finns, people from Finland. With the new arrivals came many languages. For example, the group of Norwegians that you see here pictured with their little dog, no doubt spoke Norwegian, but perhaps they spoke Swedish and Finnish too, depending on where they came from in Norway, and also because of agricultural migration between Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Heritage languages and cultural practices were maintained in the Copper Country and throughout the UP, really, through interaction at home, in neighborhoods, rural communities, social organizations, and through church services. For example, in Calumet alone, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were several language-based Catholic churches, including St. Anthony's, which was a Polish-speaking church, St. Joseph's, which was German, St. Louis, French, Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Italian, and St. John the Baptist, Croatian. And even today, some people in the Copper Country will refer to the German church, or in Lake Linden, there's St. Anne's Church, or excuse me, there's a church that's often referred to as the French church. So some of the history lives on, and how people, especially older residents, will refer to places like churches. Calumet school records from 1908 show that there were over 40 nationalities among their students. We can assume that those students spoke half as many languages. Evidence of a multilingual community also includes Houghton Hancock newspapers that were printed in 6 different languages in the early 1900s. Because the majority of settlers were not native English speakers, they typically learned an accented English from other non-native English speakers. Excuse me. I just have a dry throat. Don't worry, I'm not sick. As people mixed and mingled, their languages came into repeated contact with English. A new variety of English developed. These languages affected the sounds, the words, the grammatical structures that collectively form what we recognize today as Yooper Talk, or English in UP. Out of all of the languages spoken in the area, Finnish has had the most profound effect. The influence of Finnish on English is significant for several reasons that resulted in decades of contact between Finnish and English. For one, Finns were the largest group to immigrate to the area, and they were one of the last groups to, and they also tended to be literate. Whereas immigrant languages are typically lost by the 3rd generation. So the 1st generation would speak the heritage or the home language and maybe a little English. 2nd generation, typically bilingual. The 3rd generation usually is typically monolingual English, and that's true today too. Finns tended to be different because, one, they were literate, and that helped maintain the language through reading and writing and speaking. Also, many Finns moved to rural areas once they were able to afford land, and lived in rural communities, Finnish-speaking communities. And you can see that with road names, for example, throughout the Copper Country. Excuse me, I need to take a drink of water. Excuse me. And another reason why Finnish was maintained longer is because Finnish isn't related to English. And so it was harder for Finns to learn English than it would be, for example, German or Italian, which are related to English. So the vocabulary is sometimes similar, and there's similar grammatical structures, but Finnish is not that way at all. So it created a long contact between English and Finnish. Finnish families tended to maintain their languages for 4 and 5 generations rather than just 3. So it had decades of repeated contact with English, which then affected the sounds and grammatical structures and vocabulary that we hear today. I'd like to talk now a little bit about some of the sounds, or what we call the phonology, or how sounds work together. In this list, you can see some examples, and it's not a full description of the sounds of the dialect. And you see some symbols or letters put in brackets, and that's the International Phonetic Alphabet. Some are very obvious, like that D is a D for the voiced, what we say voiced TH, like in the, for the, and you hear that in say yada UP. The one on the second one that looks like a question mark without a dot underneath it, it's called a glottal stop. And actually it's an absence of sound. And you'll have this glottal stop or a t for what we say the voiceless th, so th. So you might hear people say Houghton, and Houghton is what ends up happening with a glottal stop, and you can do it now. I won't hear you because you're muted, but it's you can put your hand on your throat and you can say Batman or button, and you can feel your Adam's apple or your larynx jump. And what ends up happening, the air comes up to your throat, and then your glottis shuts it off. So that's why we call it a glottal stop. But it's this absence of sound, but it's, people will say things like Houghton, I say Houghton, and I have the glottal stop in there, but locally you might hear it more like Houghton. And then another example of the glottal stop would be on the end of the word south. You might hear people say south instead of south, or you might hear people say sout on the end of the T sound there. Some sounds let me see, I lost my place here because I went off a little bit, sorry. This list of sounds includes, like I said, several, but not all of the sounds. And it's important to remember that these are only some of the major phonological features. Some of these others here I'll talk about are the s for the sh sound, like in shot might be a sound like sot. And that sound is dying out, actually, not dying out, but you'll hear people do sh instead of a s sound. And I'll talk a little bit why that is in a little bit. You'll hear t, p, k, these what we call voiceless stops. The air stops when it comes out of your mouth. We call it, and it's voiceless because there's no vibration in your voice. And these sounds are always stressed in Finnish. And so you might hear them stressed here with winter or book, stop, hot, calumet. Not everybody, of course, will do this. Like anywhere, not everybody in the same place speaks the same, but you might hear some patterns of these. The low and back here that you see here, and back and low, all that refers to is the tongue. So pasty and camp is how I say those words. My tongue is more central in my mouth, but in the UP, you might hear people say pasty or camp, and the tongue goes lower and in the mouth toward the lower jaw and further back. You might hear people say boat, and the same thing is what's happening to the tongue. With that ow and I sound, the tongue is raised, and linguistics is not rocket science. It's super descriptive of how we use our mouth and tongue and teeth and jaw, all kinds of things. And so you'll hear these voiceless sounds. So you hear like ice and house. And that's also called Canadian raising. It's a real typical feature of Canada, especially Ontario. And then the first syllable of every word sometimes is stressed. And this is true for many words in English too, but in UP, you'll hear some variation. So Toivola, which is a Finnish word meaning hope, and it's a town name there. Some people will say Toivola, and you can hear the stress shift on the second syllable, but Finnish would say Toivola. Oops, sorry, I lost my cursor here. Oh, there we go. Oops, now sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. All right, so Calcite Lats is a really great example of how knowing the social and the linguistic history of an area lets you in on some local humor. These two signs, the one made in the front, it's handmade, and the one in the background you can see is the official street name sign. They're located on Quincy Hill. It's US 41, and this is coming up out of Hancock and toward Calumet, which is way down the road. And in the background, you can see some of the mine hoist here from the Quincy mine hoist. And you can see some of the old tailings there, rock tailings there. The Quincy mine was in full operation from 1846 to 1945, and many of the miners lived in company-owned housing that skirted the mine, and these were called locations. Mining families often had a cow, and in some houses would include a cow shed or a single stall barn. And someone in the family or in the neighborhood would walk that cow to communal pasture during the day. And those pastures were called flats, F-L-A-T-S, flats. And this pasture down this road was jokingly called Calcite Lats. Now, to understand why it's called that, we have to understand a little bit of the history of the area and why this sign was ever put there. In 1980s, Wilbur, or his nickname was Wimpy Salmi, he lived in this location, in the mining location. He made this street name sign. And at the time, the street didn't have a name, which was typical. A lot of streets in the rural areas didn't have names and instead were known by geographical features or families that lived in that area. Much like Steve Parks, who solicited the dictionary, he solicited the Quincy Township Board to name the street Calcite Lats. And it wasn't until 2001 where they actually did name this street Calcite Lats. And it was all because of the emergency phone system. 911 came along and streets had to have names because of that. In addition to this history behind the name, understanding the meaning relies on recognition of some linguistic features that transfer from Finnish to English. First of all, Finnish doesn't have the letter C in their alphabet. It uses a K, where we would use a C for K sounds or K sounds. Another part of Finnish is that Finnish doesn't have an SH sound, and many speakers who would speak Finnish as a first language would substitute us S first for the SH sound, and you saw that on the previous slide. Another example of Finnish contact here is the word lats. Finnish doesn't allow two consonants to begin a word, what we call a consonant cluster. So what ends up happening if people are speaking English as a second language and their first language is Finnish, oftentimes they'll drop that first consonant, not out of being lazy or not knowing English, but it just doesn't fit the way that they know how to make sounds. It's not part of Finnish phonology. So as you might have guessed, if this was a C and that S was an SH and this was a pasture, you know why it was named this, right? Calcite Lats and not Calcite Lats. So it's this pun, it's a pun, and it is a result of this language contact and transfer of English between English and Finnish. And it also is important evidence of local dialect features that have changed over time. So when people hear that, that they're not using the S for the SH anymore, they might think, oh, the dialect is dying. And that's not true, it's just changing. And partly you don't hear the S used for an SH sound in the UP very much anymore because most people, I would say probably 99.9% of the people don't speak Finnish anymore. They might speak it as a second language. They might have learned it at school or somewhere else, but people don't speak it as a first language anymore in the UP. So it's a really good example, one of a local joke that you have to know the history first to understand it. And also, it's also evidence that regional dialects change over time. And oftentimes when they change, people think that the dialect's dying, and it's not, it's just changing. And it has to change as its speakers die off or people move in and bring new languages into contact or more dialects into contact, it ends up changing. I'll talk about that in a little bit more later here. Another example of a local pronunciation is the pronunciation of sauna or sauna as sauna. And this is what we call shibboleth. And the pronunciation of sauna, it comes from Finnish, but probably Swedish, Norwegian, German, other European languages that would pronounce it that way. I think English is probably the only language that pronounces it sauna. This pronunciation not only is local, but it's also a marker of local identity. And that's what we call it a shibboleth. A shibboleth is a word that marks a local pronunciation that people locally would say and people from outside the area typically don't. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in the UP says sauna, but most people do. The use of the shibboleth, I think, is really smart here in these billboards. And the billboards were outside of Ishpeming in 2015. The insurance company uses this shibboleth in the contrast between sauna and sauna in a very smart way to show these positive meanings about what it means to be local. It also shows that this insurance company is local and that they could be trusted more, probably. They're honest, reliable, they understand you and your insurance needs. Another example of local pronunciation is the pronunciation pasty, which you see here. That's a handheld kind of meat pie with potatoes. Some people debate whether you should put rutabagas in it or not. But many outsiders will see the word pasty, and because it looks like pastry, they'll say pastry or they'll call it pasties. And this is a picture of a magnet, and the magnet is instructing outsiders, presumably, how to pronounce it. And it's also interesting to me because it says not just pasty on it and how to pronounce it, but also this duh for the at the bottom. Features of the local dialect, though, that we recognize today as signifying Yooper and Yooper Talk really are relatively new. And you can see that from these examples from 1905. They both came out of the newspaper in 1905. The first one is a parts of song lyric for the Wreck of the Julie Plant, which is a ship song from the Great Lakes, a sailor song. And it's sung traditionally or stereotypically by French Canadian speakers. And you can see that here, how this is written in what we call I dialect, or in the way that they think that the singer would be singing it. And you can see features that we recognize today as being Yooper Talk, but didn't signify that then. Then it symbolized that this person was speaking French first as a first language and then speaking English, right? So a French Canadian. De for the wind blows, then the captain, troda for throw the, and tree for 3/4. Another feature, in addition to the de and to for the and like the throw, is, and you see that in the second example from this kind, it was like a joke in the paper. Probably doesn't make much sense to us now, but it was a joke in 1905. Dat for that, and use is another feature that you hear in the UP for the plural you. So these are examples of how the dialect is relatively new, and also that what we recognize as being part of the dialect is relatively new. In the past, the dialect hadn't had time to develop, and instead these features existed, but they got associated with different identities. One being an immigrant or someone who spoke English as a second language, and the second one here as a working class. I'll talk a little bit about the vocabulary now, or what we call the lexicon. And here, like with the phonological features I gave you examples of, these are just some examples. And you might be familiar with some of these. And you can see in the parentheses how many languages have brought words into the vocabulary. This is true for English overall. Over 80% of our words are borrowed from other languages. English is really a mutt language. But what you can see here are specific languages that shape the dialect, from Canadian French to Ojibwe, Irish English, German. And you can see in the foods from Finnish, Slovenian, Croatian. One of the easiest ways to find out what languages were important in an area when the area was settled after Ojibwe or after indigenous people lived there is to look at place names. And you can see place names here in Ojibwe, Kiwana, which means a passage land or passageway, Munising, which means by the Big Island, Ishpeming, which means by the Big Rock. And those come from Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. But you can also see French here, and French were early settlers, speakers of Canadian French. And then there are some place names like Laughing Whitefish River, which is a direct translation from Ojibwe. So some of the names that look English were actually direct translations from other languages. As I said, these were are just a few examples, but again, you can see the influence of other languages on the dialect. In this map, you can also see some examples, and this is from the cover of my book. The creators or the graphic designers at University of Wisconsin Press created this. And you can see some words. I'll talk about Pank. I'll also talk about bakery that you see in the eastern part of the UP. And you can see some of the other examples that I've talked about. One of my favorites is here at the bottom, Holy Wah. It's a really good kind of exclamation, Holy Wah, like holy cow kind of a way. What's also interesting to me though, is some words, some words like Pank, I'll talk about, like I said, and Pasty is well known in the pronunciation of sauna, but the words like bakery tend to be not to be so known. And here it's not bakery, the place where the baked goods are made, but it's bakery, the baked goods themselves. And this is a direct translation from German. You'll find this used in Wisconsin, especially in the Milwaukee area. And this is an example from a music festival at Covington in the UP. And all bakery fresh from Lowry's pasty, I said pasty, sorry, pasty shop. And you see these nice big cinnamon buns here. What's curious and interesting to me is that bakery doesn't get noticed. I've never seen a t-shirt, a coffee mug, a magnet that says anything about bakery. So while some words get picked up and recognized and repeated over and over again, other words like bakery fly under the recognition radar. Not sure why that happens. Sometimes it's because of tourism and who's putting things out. If those people thought that bakery was a dialect word they should include, then we'd hear more about it. Another word that is well known in the area is pank, and it means to pat down or make compact. And this is an example entry from the Dictionary of American Regional English. We're not sure where the word comes from. You can see here, perhaps it's a blend of pack and spank. But it says also compare Norwegian and Danish banka and Swedish banka, which means to knock, tap, or beat. And Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes settled in Michigan, also Pennsylvania and upstate New York. Those areas, those three areas, also were mining regions, and we find evidence of pank in mining talk or in journals and things where people would talk about mining work. And you can see evidence here from data that they collected from different speakers. What's interesting to me about pank is that if you talk to some people in the UP, especially people who live in mining towns, because that's where the word tended to be used and still is used actually. I got a text the other day from a friend in the UP talking about panking the snow, patting it down and making it compact to make a path like you see here in this first example. But what's interesting to me is people will think it's a word unique to Michigan, and it's not, or unique to the UP, in fact, not just Michigan. And you can see that it's also used in Pennsylvania and upstate New York, or it has been in the past anyway. In addition to the sounds of the language and vocabulary, I want to talk a little bit about syntax or grammatical structures. And specifically, when we talk about syntax, it's about how words are ordered. In these examples, you can see some syntactic features, and I just pulled out three of the most common ones. One is the illative phrase, and this is the absence of a preposition, and oftentimes the article the, when you're talking about going to a place or toward a location. And you might hear people say, let's go mall, or I went post office. This is a direct transfer from Finnish. Finnish doesn't have prepositions. Instead, it uses postpositions or suffixes on the ends of nouns, where we would use a word before the noun. That's why we call them prepositions, prepositions. Finnish doesn't have articles, a, an, and the. So you'll hear people leave them out where other speakers of English would include them. And again, it's a direct transfer from Finnish. The tags a and hey, so have a nice day, a, or that's a pretty dress, hey. That's language transfer as well. And we think it comes from Cornish English, Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, or Canadian French, or maybe all three of them, because all three of those languages have a similar tag question and they're used in the same way to add emphasis. It's kind of a rhetorical marker. It's not really asking for an answer. It's to inviting conversation, inviting engagement. But you can see how all three of these languages have a very similar sounding word to a and hey. But these all were the earliest settlers to the area. And these folks mixed and mingled a lot. So we're not quite sure where it has come from. Now, one of the things too I want to look at is language attitudes and the effects of language attitudes on the dialect and how it's used. And this is an example, an extract from a student's essay, university student's essay, and it demonstrates how language attitudes can and do affect individuals, but also the dialect itself. And it's shaming people into not using. I'll read this excerpt and then I'll talk a little bit about it. 3 summers ago, while attending classes, I was sitting in class, listening to the professor read over the syllabus. She veered from the syllabus when she began speaking about the upcoming oral presentations. At this point, she polled the class to find out how many Yoopers were in attendance. I looked around and no one raised a hand, including myself. So you know there were other local students here. I did this for 3 reasons. 1, I was a freshman. 2, the class terrified me. And 3, I was not going to be studied all term as if I were a dying species. She continued with a comment about Yoopers who attend the university by stating, when they're giving presentations, I always feel so sorry for them. The class chuckled, agreeing that Yoopers sound funny. and showed sympathy. About 10 minutes later, I left the class and almost left the university. Linguistic prejudice and related language attitudes have real and lasting effects, especially for those who are labeled as speaking bad English, whether it's a social variety like African American English or a regional variety like Yooper Talk. For this student, the effects were significant. She dropped a class and she almost dropped out of the school. Part of my interest in studying Yooper Talk and language variation in general is my belief that we can foster social understanding, respect, and compassion by creating language awareness. The more we understand about the history of a dialect, the languages that have come into contact that shape it, and their effects on the dialect sounds, words, and grammatical structures, the better we understand the social and linguistic factors that have shaped it. This understanding can lead us to know that dialects are seen as bad English or improper are actually rule governed, resulting from language contact. And we saw that with the illative phrase. So let's go mall, for example. There's nothing wrong with that. It's part of the dialect's grammar. Unfortunately, the prejudice that's often attached to dialects and accents is not grounded in linguistic fact, but instead on prejudice about people, the people who speak it. And we see that here. It's important to realize that all of us, you, me, your high school English teacher, we all have a dialect. No one is dialect free. It's the attitudes and values we attach to certain ways of speaking and thereby to certain groups of people that make us think that some of us are dialect free and others speak at the least with a quaint accent and at the most with bad English. All dialects are grammatical, rule governed, although the rules vary. That's why we call them varieties of a language. As we've seen in these examples, history and interaction resulting in language contact are the key ingredients that shape language variation and that have shaped this dialect, Yooper Talk. And here we see how attitudes toward dialects and perceptions of dialect speakers are also significant factors in shaping dialects and affecting their use. Now, along with linguistic prejudice comes a lot of pride as well, and negative stereotypes associated with what it means to be a Yooper in the dialect. At the same time, there is this great pride about what it means to be a Yooper and even what it means to sound like a Yooper. For example, in the UP, there comes a great pride about being local, about a do-it-yourself, get by with what you have independence that's rooted in a long history of hard labor in an isolated place that has a climate that can be very difficult to live in, especially in bug season and in the winter. And this is a magnet, and it reflects those connections between identity, place, and language with proud, tough, independent, and by mapping Yooper right onto the UP. Reflected in this magnet is the most compelling reason for the maintenance of dialect differences, identity. Our language is the most obvious way in which we mark who we are, where we've grown up, who our families are, who our communities are, where we've been. This includes not only our region, but our social class, our ages, our genders, our race, ethnicity, religious affiliations, education, and all the different ways that we identify ourselves. Language is our badge of identity. How else do we show where we're from and who we are? And for this reason, dialects, including Yooper Talk, aren't dying out. They're actually here to stay, and in some places they're getting stronger. As the linguistic landscape shrinks through our online and geographic interconnectedness, local ways of speaking remain our badge of identity, and thus dialects are here to stay. And so to conclude, how do dialects like Yooper Talk emerge? Over time and through interaction, through us, as we shape history, as we share our attitudes about dialects in social media, and conversations with friends and coworkers and family, as we interact with others, our dialects and languages come into contact. As with any dialect, the sounds, the words, the phrases, sentence structures combine in unique ways to create UP English. By knowing the history of UP English, we come to understand how people, place, and identity are tightly, and language are tightly bound together. My hope is that by understanding the history of the dialect, that you come to understand not only how and why it is developed, but you also have how we all have a role in affecting language change and affecting language attitudes and perceptions about certain groups of speakers. I also hope that this understanding leads you to an appreciation of the UP, if you don't already have one, of Yoopers and language variation and change in general. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my slide so I can see you all.
Thank you, Kathryn. We're going to open it up. If anybody has any questions, you can type them into the chat or onto the Facebook, and we will ask them for you.
Thanks. And if it doesn't have to be questions, if you have comments or
Sure.
stories to share.
Everyone's being shy. Okay, here's a question. What is the impact of Michigan Tech University been to the Yooper Talk with people from different areas coming to the local area? Has Yooper Talk gained publicity from Michigan Tech grads going to other areas of the state and country?
I don't know if it's, well, it might be from, a lot of Michigan Tech grads are from the local area, but not all. I mean, they have a high percentage of international students. And because of the transient nature of students, that they're not usually there very long, it hasn't had, and because that the university and students tend to be more isolated in the fact that not mixing and mingling with maybe as many other people in the local area. I'm not sure that the university itself has had an effect on the local dialect, but it has had an effect on local attitudes about what it means to be a Yooper. When I was doing my research and interviews, one person who worked at the university, she was an administrative assistant there and local, she felt that there was a lot of teasing, and not just teasing, but disregard for what it meant to be a Yooper, and that people would say things about the way she talked, or there would be signs on campus mocking the dialect. And so I think you see some language attitudes. And in fact, that example of the student essay I showed you came from a student at Tech, but a long time ago, about 20 years ago, maybe 15. Anyway, so I'm not sure if there's that kind of interaction to shape the local dialect, but it sure has an effect on attitudes about what it means to be a Yooper and about the dialect itself.
Someone else commented, thank you for the presentation. I grew up a troll, Northern Lower Michigan, and really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
I have a question myself. It's not so much about the Yooper, but about all accents, and like the Southern accent and the Michigan accent. Do you think because people are moving around more that they're going to gradually disappear?
That's the thought, you know, and the people also think because of TV or social media or radio that, you know, dialects are dying out. But we have to have person, you know, interaction, like you mentioned, people moving around. What ends up happening, though, is that dialects will change, but in some places they'll get stronger. There's research that has shown that people who will move to an area will pick up local dialect features that they hear, and then that increases their use and helps them maintain. And I can give a personal example. My husband and I went to the UP for a summer so I could collect data, and he worked as a kayak guide in Copper Harbor, and within 2 weeks he was saying, and we're both from Ohio originally, he was saying A and raising his vowels. So, you know, saying things like house or ice. So, and it was something unconscious. There's actually a theory called accommodation theory that we do this to fit in, right? We want to show that we fit in. And so we unconsciously or subconsciously change the way we talk. There's other research that shows that people move to some areas that would use what we call a prefixing, like affixing to, that in the South, the research was done in Arkansas, showed that people moving into this area in Arkansas started saying things like affixin to when they didn't before, because they wanted to show that they were local or that they wanted to fit in. So dialects will change. I don't think there'll ever be one monolingual or monogamous, not monogamous, monolithic is what I'm trying to say, dialect in the US. It's just too big, but even in a small area, there's so much variation. If you live in a small town, you know that not everybody speaks the same. And like I said, it's our badge of identity. And how else do we show that we're from a certain place or associated with certain groups or other ways of identifying ourselves?
Any other questions, anybody? Okay, this was great. I did grow up as a Yooper and it brought back a lot of good memories. I'm trying to learn Finnish online now, so this was helpful for that too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, good luck with your Finnish. It's hard. One, it's because of the pronunciation is so different and the grammatical structures. But there's really good, I've been watching, there's some great YouTube videos and things too. So good luck. Thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk.
Okay, so it looks like nobody has any other questions. So we're going to call this an evening.
All
I
right.
want to
Thank
remind
you very
you,
much.
well, thank you, Kathryn, for coming. We all enjoy the program very much. Remind everyone that we have another program in 2 weeks. Gangsters Up North, Robert Knapp's book about during the 20s and 30s and the mob people who vacationed in Northern Michigan. So we're kind of doing a Northern Michigan theme this month.
That's great.
And I hope everyone enjoyed it. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks again, everyone. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks again for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for coming.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. That was very interesting.